this very wonderful organisation, Energy Consumers Australia. And I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the board. This is a board networking and stakeholder forum. And we have only one other board member than me present. That better? Thank you. Where's Gavin? Everybody knows Gavin. There he is, down the back there. Anyway, we've got one down with COVID, one in Spain, and one came off a motorbike. So we're a little short of our board members today. I'd like to start, as we normally do, by paying our respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and thank them for their care of this country for tens of thousands of years and for their willingness to continue to share their culture. We're going to hear from Anna Collyer today, the chair of the AMC, the chair of the ESB, and maybe a few other things that I've missed Anna. She's got some very big jobs. We're delighted that she's come. And it's sort of the first time we get together to have somebody of her eminence in the energy system come and share her thoughts with us on one of the most challenging issues I think that any country faces, and Australia in particular, a sort of canary in the transitions that are going on in energy. So delighted to have you here. Anna and I go back quite a long way, actually, when she was still a partner at Allen's, and we did a bit of stuff together. We've also got Lynn talking to us today about these two transitions, and then we're going to have a Q&A, because the whole point is to get some real participation on these issues at our stakeholder events. After that, we've got networking and some canapes and time, an hour or so, for you to just hang around and chat about issues. And during that time, Dan, who is there at the back, is going to be running around with somebody with a camera. Oh, yes, hi. And he's going to be asking you, if you are willing, obviously, to make a quick comment, asking you your thoughts about the challenges of these two transitions, either for your organizations, for yourself personally, however you want to come at that issue, so that we can add that kind of personal view into the session and onto our website. So if you're willing to be public about that, that would be great. If you don't want to, that's fine too. So we've got two presentations, one after the other, both brief, given the issues that we're dealing with, and then I'll come up and we'll moderate an interactive session, and then we'll get to the canapes and drinks. So would you welcome with me Anna Collyer, chair of the AMC and ESB.
Thank you so much, Louise, and it's really wonderful to be here again. We can't say it enough how great it is to be doing these events in person after all this time doing them online. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land where we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present here today. So it is fantastic to have an opportunity to talk about customers in particular, who of course are at the heart of everything that we're doing in these two transitions and all the work that we do at the AEMC and the ESB. I feel like I start every one of these presentations, and no doubt you're all tired of hearing it and you all know it really well. We are going through an unprecedented time of change in the sector. It's affecting every point in the supply chain. In fact, recently I heard this described as not just a once-in-a-generation change, but a once-in-human history change, in that we're trying to stop using a fuel source, it's the first time we will have ever done that, and replace it entirely with some other way of supporting our lifestyle. So as a result, our energy system is becoming increasingly complex, and what we're seeing, of course, is it's becoming increasingly distributed, and for better or worse, our customers are getting much more involved. And I really want to talk about different ways in which customers are getting involved, because it's important to recognise that diversity. I really like this idea of the two transitions that ECA has developed, because it does draw attention to this customer end of the spectrum that I think can get overlooked when we spend a lot of time focusing on the first transition, where we're looking at utility scale, the transmission investment, etc., etc. but really what's happening with customers and their resources, and I also do really like the phrase customer energy resources instead of distributed energy resources, is fundamentally changing the way human beings are interacting with the energy system, and we need to pay attention to that and make sure that we get it right for customers. So while I'm more than happy to talk at any time and take questions today about capacity mechanism, transmission access reform or essential system services, I actually wanted to spend this time talking about the other work streams that are being done through the ESB and all of the market bodies on customer energy resources. And I'd like to do two things. I want to talk a bit about the how, because I actually think to navigate this second part of the transition, we need to work a bit differently and approach our job a little bit differently than the way we traditionally come to our reform processes. And then I will have a look at the what, but one of the things about this area is it's so vast and complex, there's sort of no way of getting into everything. So I've just picked 3 areas to give you a bit of an insight into what we're doing, the 3 things that the AMC in particular is working on, and really by way of illustrating like the couple of things that I'm going to talk to about in the how. So just by way of context, another few things that I always say. Now, I'm not sure if I'm on the right slide, but I'm not going to change it over. That's right, I've got it. First thing, net zero. Last year it was kind of like a small step but a big step to get to the point where all governments of Australia are now saying we are transitioning to net zero by 2050. Of course, we need to see what happens this weekend. I'm very optimistic that that statement will continue to hold on Monday morning. And what that means is that we can now talk about the how, and there's lots of debate about the how and how fast, but that's a different debate than the whether, so as in whether we should be doing it. So I'm pretty positive about that as a move forward for us. From the AMC's perspective, it's meant that we're able to quite clearly align our strategic plan and our strategic identity with decarbonisation in a way that delivers for customers with the other bits of the trilemma, reliability and of course affordability, which is no doubt getting a lot of attention right now. In terms of our customer energy resources, I've got 3 quick slides just to illustrate the point that Louise made. Australia is at the absolute pointy end of this. So in relation to solar PV, we've got our 3 million households with solar PV, 15,000 megawatts. That's going to more than double by 2030. And by 2050, we're looking at solar rooftop together with other distributed resources or customer resources, potentially contributing up to 45% of our electricity needs. So where we are with batteries and EVs is not on this scale yet. And it's a really interesting time for us because one of the issues I think that we grappled with the solar PV was it sort of took everyone by surprise, the extreme investment that we saw, and I think our regulatory frameworks weren't set up to deal with it. So actually we've got this opportunity right now as we enter batteries and electric vehicles to get it set up in a way that's going to work for all customers before we get too far down the track of that investment. That's the battery one and that's the EV one. So I think batteries, so we've got about 45,000 at the moment. AEMO is suggesting that we'll get up to, whatever that says, something million by the 2040. With the EVs, we're looking at 11 million by 2040. So huge investment in these assets by our customers. Just before I get to that one, the third thing that I want to say by way of background context goes back to a point that I alluded to earlier. We don't have a homogenous set of customers. And I think that's really important for us to remember, and that we need to make sure that what we're doing is thinking about all of the customers. And I think about them along a spectrum, although there's absolutely much more variation than this. At the one end, we do have our customer who invests in the solar panel, who invests in the batteries, who's got their app, who's really engaged and wants to participate. At the other end, of course, we've got customers who are unable to invest in these assets. And then in the middle, we've got kind of like quite a lot of people who will probably buy solar panels, who will no doubt buy an electric vehicle, but they don't really want to participate in the energy market. They're really buying it because it's a thing that they want to use for their lifestyle. So we need to keep in mind all of these different customers when we're thinking about the way we want to set up the system and make sure that the system's working for everybody. So let me move now to what I want to talk about, which is the 2 ways I think we need to work a bit differently in the CER space, given that context, in order to make sure that we're getting the best outcomes for customers from our reform work. So the first one is, and this is where I will get to this slide, there is a lot going on in this space. So again, this is one of those things that you will hear at every one of these talks, no doubt. There's a lot going on across the whole sector in terms of reform, and we are very well aware of that. But in this space, I think it's even more pointy. So when I'd started at the AMC in Essential System Services, there were 7 different rule changes, which I thought at the time was, and still do think, is this enormous complexity in that. But if you take a bit of a look at this slide, which if you've seen the P2025 report is listed from there, this was our first attempt to try and harness the work that is going on or that needs to happen over the next 3 years in customer energy resources to get us where we think we need to be in terms of that space. So it's obviously a very busy slide, and it, as I said, was a first attempt to try and articulate what it is we want to be doing in this area. So the first way in which I think that we need to think differently about this, certainly from my perspective as chair of the ESB, is that it's not clearly one big work program. So the work that we do at ESB on capacity, the work that we're doing on transmission access, like they're really complex. There are some moving parts, but ultimately we know who's driving them. We've got a particular task that's been set for us and we've got a particular time frame to do it. And that's an ESB role to deliver. Whereas in this case, there are so many different things that are going on that are being led by many different parties. And where I see the ESB role here is much more about bringing parties together. It's about enabling collaboration. It's about helping to see where connections are between different work streams, making that visible, helping to prioritise things in a way that makes sense from a sequencing perspective. And in some cases, ASB will pick up some work streams that it thinks are important that aren't naturally falling somewhere else. But it's a really different role and one that I think it's helpful to have that central body to play. The second thing that I think is important for us to do is to keep trying to refine this, because when we try and articulate to groups of people such as yourselves, what are we doing, that's sort of helpful because it's got 3 customer outcomes and 3 horizons and a whole bunch of coloured boxes, but it's still really hard to grapple with. So we have gradually been improving it. This is this year's iteration where we look at, this is the work that we're doing this year. So we've divided it into the 5 subject matter areas. Sorry, you don't need to go into the detail, it's more just to illustrate the point. And this has got the same thing with who's doing what, which I find actually one of the most helpful things. So we keep trying to better refine what is the work that's going on and who is doing it, and how can we articulate what the purpose of all that work is and how does it fit together. The third thing that we're doing at the ESB is that we have really focused on our customer energy resources governance to separate it out from the other governance, again, to give it the priority that it needs and to make sure that we're focusing on the right things. So since I've been at the ESB, we've had an advisory group, which is senior stakeholders that we consult with to give us insights, and we were covering the whole work program with them. At the start of this year, we set up a specific group for customer energy resources. 2 reasons. One was to make sure that we had the right people in the room, but the second one was to make sure that we were devoting all of that time to talking about these issues. And I have to say those meetings are fantastic. There's a lot of people probably here who attend them. We get a lot of really great insights, and it's just a different level of conversation than what we will have when we're trying to deal with all of the issues in the same forum. The second thing that we've done, which was sort of counterintuitive, we've set up another working group. We deliberately didn't do this at the start of the year because we are very conscious of how stretched everybody is. There's so much going on, particularly from a customer advocacy perspective, it's hard to get to everything. But over time, what we found was that it could be helpful for us to try and bring together some of the consultations being done by different market bodies. And so we have now set up a CER working group. We're going to use it for 2 purposes. One, as I said, is for market bodies to funnel their consultations through so that we've got a bit of a stable group that we can go to, and that hopefully makes it easier for the people in that group than having many, many different things to attend. And it also means that there are some things that, as I said, the ESB's taken a lead on because it feels it's not naturally falling somewhere else, and that's a great place for us to be able to consult on that work. So that's been, I think, another really good development, is just getting that focused attention on these issues. The second way that I think we need to work differently in relation to customer energy resources is that stepping into the customer's shoes. So, of course, everything that we're doing across all of the reform program is about getting better outcomes for customers. Like, that is the number one goal. But I do think that when you are talking about an asset in which the customer has invested, that impacts something that they own, it sits on their roof or in their garage, there's like a really different level of conversation. And so making sure that we're starting at the customer perspective on what it looks like from their point of view is so critical. And we actually came to this again by a bit of an evolution. So you may recall that last year the ESB had a pilot for the maturity plan. Now, I think the maturity plan was originally intended to be more like an iterative process that you might use for IT development, where you kind of learn things and over 6 months you learn the next thing, and over the 6 months you learn the next thing. And we set up the first one of these to look at the issue of minimum system load and how does that look from a customer's perspective as opposed to how does it look from a system's perspective. And what we found was the best thing that came out of that conversation was getting a whole bunch of different stakeholders in the room talking about things from the customer's perspective. And what we also found was that even though we had quite diverse views, everyone had a shared purpose of getting the best outcome from the customer. So we actually had a better conversation because we were able to have that shared purpose. So in the way of good IT projects or innovation projects, we decided to pivot, and now we want to use that forum over the next 3 years in 6 monthly releases to go through different particular issues from a customer perspective. And then the purpose of it is to produce a report, a knowledge sharing report, that we then provide to the different agencies that are doing the different pieces of work and say, look, this is what we've learned about what customers think about this particular issue. We think it's relevant to the work that you're doing, and we've kind of collected it all for you. The first one that we did of these has been really interesting. We're sort of part way through it. We're looking at barriers and enablers to customers getting the most out of flexible demand. And we've learned quite a few things quite quickly. So we asked, engaged someone to do some desktop research for us. And what we found is that there's some really important gaps in the research. So the research showed, oh, this is what happens with early adopters, this is what happens at first stage in the process. But we're kind of not seeing what is the research for the people who are, you know, the missing people in this story, or what's happened as people go along that journey. So that's a really good thing for us to learn. We have to start that from scratch to understand more about that. The second two things that we've learnt are two things which, and I do find this sometimes happens, you do a whole bunch of work and then you come up with some conclusions that you think in retrospect are obvious. So two of the obvious barriers, / if you do it badly, enablers if you do it well, that diversity of customers. So if you think you're setting something up for one size fits all, that's going to just not work for you. And trust. So customer trust, so the customers who do engage, having a good experience, and the customers who aren't engaging to not be adversely affected, that is a critical part of it. So again, perhaps not surprising when I say it like that, but it's almost like the exercise of going through that conversation and agreeing it and elevating it, that I think makes it a really useful piece of work that we can then share, as I said, with market bodies who are working in the area. So let me now come to a couple of the areas that I thought I would touch on. I've got three. They did come off the earlier slides, and as I said, the three things that AMC's got on its plate at the moment. So the first is technical standards, and I know this can't sound any more like something that's all about the system and not about the customer, but actually it is absolutely all about the customer. And as you probably know, this arose out of a rule change request actually that AMC received from the ESB, which said, oh, we think it's taking too long to develop these technical standards. We want to set up a committee that can do it instead. And when we looked at that, we went, oh, well, I actually don't know that that's necessarily the right way to approach technical standards, but also there's a much bigger piece of issue here. And as we examined it, we kind of looked at there's all these different kind of things that need to happen with technical standards. There's who decides which ones need to be focused on or prioritised, who does develop them, how do you decide which ones go into the, you know, become mandatory, how do you decide how that gets into the NER, how do you keep track of that and kind of circle back, and most importantly, how do you ensure that they're being complied with? And so what we decided to do was, instead of making the rule as requested, we've set up a review where we now want to look at all of these issues. And of course, what they really are about is that customer trust. So when customers buy an asset, it does what they need it to do, as well as other customers who are engaging with the system, that the way those assets are engaging with the system is going to work for them as well. Now, in terms of the way this interacts back with that complex matrix of all the different work pieces that are going on, there's actually quite a few, and it was last week I think we had our CR advisory group, and these became illuminated. So one of the things that the ESB's been continually asked by stakeholders to work on is this question of roles and responsibilities within a CER-heavy world. And, you know, we've been grappling with, well, what does that question mean? And I had been focusing very much on, oh, that's just a kind of a question as between distributors and AEMO, who does what? But it became apparent that the roles and responsibilities extends much further than that to new service providers who might be supporting customers with their CER, or manufacturers who are making it, or very importantly, installers who are coming to your house to put it in. And so that much broader piece of roles and responsibilities then intersects with what we're going to have a look at in our review. So it's important for us to be checking with the ESB on that. And then the other piece that is also intersects is the work that the AER's just kicked off on, which is looking at a review of the retailer authorisations, which is very much focused on, if we do have new service providers in the market supporting customers with their CER, what's the right customer protections and regulatory framework for those new service providers relative to retailers. And so again, I kind of think that feels like it's going to, all three of those things intersect. So again, it's so important for us to be working together closely with these reforms because they all intersect so closely. The second area that I thought I'd touch on is a rule change that we've just received on flexible trading arrangements. Also came out of the work that the ESB did last year. AEMO's been working on this, and I understand they've been working closely with the ECA as well. Again, something that feels terribly technical because it's about, in effect, being able to have a meter behind the meter, so sub-metering arrangements, but ultimately goes to this idea that a customer could have two different service providers, one for their ordinary electricity use and another one to help them manage, for example, their electric vehicle charging and potentially discharging into the system, and to facilitate that in a technical way. And so AMC will be kicking off that as a rule change process, and clearly that relates very heavily back to the AER's work on authorisations and what service providers might need to be, what customer protections might be needed for the new service providers that could be enabled by us setting up these flexible trading arrangements. Again, this is really a question about trust, and if we have new service providers coming in, what's the experience of the customer with them? Does the customer feel that they have somewhere that they can go if they have dispute resolution like our current ombudsman scheme? So having those pieces of work intersect, we think, is really critical. And then finally, metering, and I was having a lovely conversation with Tim about metering just before we started. And again, I tend to pick up metering, maybe not every talk, but every second talk, because I've worked on it for a long time, and it's an area that is very close to my heart as well. The AMC had to pause its metering review at the end of last year because of some sequencing issues and resourcing issues that we have, but really pleased to say that we've just kicked it off again. We think this is a critical area, and again have been engaging closely with ECA on this, as we understand it's one of their priorities as well. So for us, metering is very much about not just the benefits that it can deliver to a customer who can get more information about their own usage, but also the data that can be provided to other players in the system, distributors, policymakers, and that can help those entities do their job better for the benefit of customers. So when we're looking at what we might be doing in the review, there's two things. There's one is looking at, well, we are very acknowledge that the current framework has not led to a rollout in the way that we thought it would. So what would we change to get more meters out there? And I think there's sort of a bunch of different things that we've been looking at and had some interesting early conversations with the ECA on it. But once the meters are there, how do we make sure that the people who can benefit from the data, both customers and other groups, get access to that data in a way that is safe, secure, respects privacy, but gives the benefit of this data? And so again, when we think about how this links to other work streams, the ESB, of course, has a data strategy, which, like any good corporate, is going, we can make a lot of use of our data, and we should be learning from it so that we can do better things. So that's an important piece of work. Another one is around power quality, which relates back to the work that we've been doing around enabling more customer energy resources, so we can get more data about power quality, for example. And then linking all the way back to the technical standards and compliance, having more of these meters out there can actually be a way that we can learn more about what's happening in the system, which can give us some indications around compliance. Customer insights on this lovely piece of work that the ECA did for us at the start of this review, which was almost like a Dorothy Dixer, I suppose, but we wanted to understand what customers thought about meters. And funnily enough, another obvious answer, customers really don't care about their electricity meter. First laugh of the afternoon. But what they do care about is the services that meters can provide. And of course, they care about things that make the system work better if that lowers the costs to customers overall. And so what we really want to make sure that we are doing at the AMC is that where we take steps in this area to be very clear about, well, what are the costs and how they're going to be recovered, but what are these overall benefits? Like, there's a range of different benefits to different parties, and how do those two things stack up? So let me conclude. What I wanted to leave you with today is two things. The first of all is to how important it is to the AMC and the ESB to be focusing on the customer, starting with the customers, standing in the customer's shoes and starting with the customer's perspective in our work in this area. The second thing is that we do think we need to work a bit differently, and if collaboration is important in any space, it's kind of like important to the nth degree in this space. The third thing is it's not just the institutions collaborating together, but with everything. Stakeholder input is critical. Again, I was just talking to Tim about this earlier, and that it's really important that we get those customer voices, and so us trying to find the way to make it easy for you to do that is so important. So we are always open to feedback on how that can improve. And lastly, I think we just wanted to really recognise the fantastic work that ECA does. We really enjoy collaborating with ECA. It's a really wonderful way for us to be able to access your insights and research. And we look forward to continuing to work with you and with all of you as we progress this space. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anna. That was absolutely fascinating talk, and watching the thinking change as you work with the issues. I'd now like to introduce Lynn Gallagher, the CEO of Energy Consumers Australia, and one of, I think, the very interesting experts in Australia. And Lynn.
I'm going to be very brief because I think there's so much in what Anna's presented that I think I don't want to be between you and a very interesting discussion. I think just a couple of things I want to say. First, about what Anna's outlined and the way that we've made huge progress in a short space of time. All the times, in all the sentences, in all those minutes, you just heard Anna say, we walk in the customer's shoes, we want to hear from consumers, we start with consumers. That isn't what was happening 2 years ago. What was happening was often, and many of you have been part of this, conversations where, well, that's all very interesting, but we're the technical people, we're the engineers, we're the economists, and consumers are going to really like what we are doing for them because we're designing this brilliant system. And, you know, many technical people saying, again, very interesting, but it's out of scope. So I just really want to acknowledge, recognise and congratulate the market bodies, ESB, for how they are now thinking about embedding people, humans, in design questions and in the regulatory framework, because it's not easy and it's confronting. People are diverse. There is not a single consumer. So I think it's amazing. And also, you know, the consumer insights collaboration is fundamental to continuing to embed that in practice in the way you do things. And Claire's done it in the AER. You know, a couple of years ago, a friend of mine, Sarah Proudfoot, came to me, Jim, you know, nice to see you here as well, said, oh, I wonder what people want in bills. You know, we keep getting all this conflicting advice from many of the advocates in this room and many other advocates who've been advocating for years that bills should be this or bills should be that. And Sarah said, I think I'm going to do something radical, like, why don't we actually ask consumers what they want in a bill? So they've gone from bringing in the Behavioural Economics Team Australia in Premiers and Cabinet to now asking consumers in their process and setting up people who are expert in consumer insights. And the answer is there isn't one size fits all for consumers. There's no one consumer. And consumers can, fall on different sides of the issue depending on what you're talking about. The same consumer can want one thing and mutually and consistently want another thing at a different time. So I think it's fundamental. The last thing I'll do is just really, I guess, maybe take an opportunity to talk about the 3 pillars of ECA's policy agenda, and maybe introduce some of my team, not by individual name, but just so when you get to chat afterwards, you'll know the context. So the first thing that many of you will hear me say in different forums, and I'm not going to stop saying it, I'm going to keep banging on about it for a while, and it'll drive you all nuts. But electricity prices went up, stayed up, they bumped up a bit, they bumped down a bit, but they're 30 cents a kilowatt hour retail. That's high by historical standards. That's what it costs when we produced it in municipal power stations in real terms. So prices are fundamental to this transition and a better future. And with the significant investment we're going to need in the first transition, with interest rates impacting on the sunk investments and the assets still to be paid for that already make up our grid, prices, the outlook for prices is going to be very difficult, and we will be pushing quite hard on if there's additional investment, that it's efficient, that it's efficiently located, that all the assets are being utilised to their full capacity, and that's the only way you can contain prices. But make no mistake, it is a challenging part of our transition. The second bit, though, and some people don't often understand if you don't spend all day thinking about consumers and electricity the way I do, or gas as well. People can think that bills and prices are the same thing. They're actually not. As a mathematician, price times quantity equals bills. But also there's an opportunity for new business models to unlock the potential of cheaper rates when electricity is abundant, which it will be during the day, and it'll be relatively abundant at night. Unfortunately, it's going to be very, very expensive between when solar stops producing and wind comes on, or solar hasn't started in the morning. So Anna was talking about flexibility, she was talking about new providers. That's where we're going to see some real opportunities to drive bills, or to drive bill outcomes that are better for consumers. So prices absolutely, but bills are absolutely critical. And that's the work of our energy systems and markets team, really thinking about business models, choice, and also fundamentally consumer agency. Anna's also touched on it when she was talking about governance of technical standards. We have to think about who are the trusted providers of information, and they may be trusted, but they may be giving you the wrong information. But also, how are we going to get this information out there about, the different products, the different services, the different assets, and all of those things currently fall outside the energy regulatory framework. So we're focusing very much not on how you regulate the sale of energy by energy companies, but how energy is bought. And so not to insist that we draw these strange lines, which we've been able to do in the past because energy was sold the same way for 100 years. So that's the challenge I've set my large-ish energy services and markets team, and I'm very proud of all the work they've done, including working with the AMC on smart metering. And the last thing I would say as well is the opportunities are not spread evenly across our society. And it's traditional to think about energy poverty, but I think we really need to think about energy inclusion and to think about the fact that if you own a roof, own a driveway, and you have the means to actually put on solar and have a well-insulated house, you can inoculate yourselves in some ways against some of these bill impacts or price impacts in a way that people who live in multi-unit dwellings, people who are renting, and then people who don't have the income or the wealth. And we are in danger of having a two-tier energy system where costs are relatively affordable for those with means and roofs and driveways, and not for others. And We are going to have to solve that because if that's where we land somewhere on the pathway to 2050, that is not stable. It's not fair, it's not just, but it's also not stable from a societal point of view. So I have my energy inclusion team of one, which I'm hoping to expand. That's Kerry. Brian heads he has to get prices down, and that'll be his performance measure. And Jacqueline heads the energy services and markets team, no pressure, because she's covering all of the things that Anna talked about in her talk. But it's a great time to be part of this, thinking about system design, thinking about regulatory frameworks, but also thinking about what lies outside of that, that also is going to go to business models, innovation, change, and consumer-focused opportunity. So thanks, Anna, very much.
Just come back up, Anna. Yeah, just we'll get you a couple of microphones, or a microphone that you can share. So just while Lynn and Anna are getting settled, I was reflecting
Testing.
as they were both talking.
Testing.
It was a bit of a light bulb moment when we realised there were two transitions going on simultaneously, not one, and both of them are absolutely critical. And one would be enough, frankly, to deal with. But the decarbonisation transition, you could have exactly the same system. You just decarbonise it, but it's still the same system. We've got a different challenge, which is that a whole lot of consumers are going to be producing their own energy and want a stake in that system. And I'm really pleased that Anna has chosen quite deliberately to start using the term consumer energy resources or consumer energy assets. Distributed energy resources is accurate, but you can see the point of view that that's coming from. That's coming from outside the consumer's home. For the consumer, it's not distributed, it's in their home or on their driveway, so it's theirs, their asset. So it's an important change of perspective and how we approach the problem. So let's start with this discussion and get some questions. I have a particular question, but I'll wait because I suspect it's going to be asked anyway. So I'm going to start with Gavin because that's favoritism, and he always asks a very difficult and interesting question. So Gavin.
I haven't really got one at the moment, but what does come to mind, and I think it's like following up on what Lynn was saying, is it is going to be not homogenous. And I think, and having been part of the rule change for tariff reform, I think, what do you think the foundations are that allow everybody to have an opportunity in the change, whether they're renters or homeowners, or whether they've got roof space or garages? And what challenges do you see there, and opportunities to not leave anybody behind?
Me to start, or do you want to go? Thanks, Anna. Well, what I would say is we're working on the answers. Where we're starting is you have to start with the quality of housing. If people who have well-insulated houses, people who bought a house after 2005, so we know that people in rental housing, rich and poor, live in the worst housing in that sense, or relatively worse. So I think we tend to think about we have to find energy solutions in the energy system to the consumer, their home, the fabric of their home, or frankly, if it's a small business, the same thing. So there's some fundamental things that I think we lost sight of about, the built environment that are absolutely critical. I think we also, and I don't know the answer to this, and many of you know I've been thinking about pricing for many years and I've changed my mind a number of times, but we do have to emphasise again that the cost of the grid is a shared asset. People who have solar, people who have batteries are going to be still using the grid. And what's a fair way of ensuring that all those costs are recovered and that, some people can't, benefit or pay less? We've got data which shows that people in the top income quintile over a decade have paid 1.5% of their income on energy. And at the middle and bottom, it's doubled, literally. So in the middle income, it's 2.5%, and it's getting up to 3 to 4. So I think those are the other issues. And then, frankly, weirdly, I'm going to say electric vehicles is the game changer that potentially could bring down costs for everyone. If we use the distribution network more, use those assets more instead of only at the maximum capacity 11% of the year, you can actually bring down the unit costs of networks quite significantly. So it's one area, a bit like people have talked about solar bringing down wholesale prices or putting downward pressure. EVs can do it too. So again, I think I've abandoned the idea of tariff reform as sort of the great equaliser. We've actually got to think about how we ensure that people have affordable bills wherever they are in the income distribution.
I don't know that I can answer that, Lynn. But I think the work that we did last year on the distribution reforms, and as I said, it's hard to do that work once you've got everyone who's invested in the assets, which is why I'm keen to be making sure we're doing the hard thinking now before we end up with everybody who's got their electric vehicles, which has the risk of embedding the same kind of problem and the same kind of difficulty in implementing a solution, because you've got people who've legitimately invested in an asset. So I think really trying to, and we've been talking a little bit about this at the advisory group, what is the future vision, and can we kind of get a picture of that so that we can start now with what are the really important things to do for us to move towards there.
Thank you. Yes, Tim. And can I say, by the way, ECA people, you are allowed to ask questions too, if you want to.
On the same.
Not working?
No, the lights are out.
Well done, Marie. There you go.
Sort of on the same theme, Annie, on the chart you put up, tariff reform or tariffing was the right end of the future, maybe sometime. And our regulatory processes for tariff reform are inherently very slow because of the way the rules have been set up, etc. But when we look at where we're going to, like you should get to the future and then come back to look at the inclusion things that Lynn raised and you raised as well. If we get to the future and look back, what do we need to have, particularly if people are building these assets, and where the networks, as I see it, are a platform. I see it more from my data experience, that they're interconnecting, the data flows are there. It's like the internet, packetization of energy. And if we get to the point that says why we want that to be successful, then we've got to have that as a low friction type activity so that we encourage the flows, so that people are able to choose to consume energy to preheat or pre-cool their house, or those things that change, and we get better productivity out of the network and price signals to the network. But at the moment, at the very point that you just said then about we don't want people to make investments now that are going to cause us a problem in the future. And what we've seen with solar and what we're seeing with batteries is all the salespeople's focus is cost avoidance of the network tariff. And it's unsustainable. It is simply unsustainable. And my question is that if the consumer's the participant in doing those services, how do we change that around? In much the way that the transmission, the networks connect to transmission deliver their energy, the consumers do. How do we bring forward that tariff reform so we can make all those other decisions if it's the platform? Because we don't have the right foundation, we're not going to be able to succeed. So we're up a bit of asthma.
I think, you've hit the nail on the head that tariff reform is one of the trickiest issues, and that was certainly our experience last year. And it really is what we found was gaining some willing participants who can take a lead on it. So I was having a conversation recently with one of what I see as one of the more innovative retailers who was talking about an experience with a particular distributor, and we suggested that maybe it might be useful to talk to another distributor because we were seeing different anecdotes coming out in relation to that distributor. So we do need to get our industry to take a bit of a lead on it as well. So there's sort of like coming at it from both angles, both a push and a pull. Whether we should be accelerating that particular piece of work is something that, we're really happy to take views on. As I said, we spent a lot of time trying to just get our arms around what are all the different things that need to be done and what is a sensible order in which to do them. But that's by no means that we've got that answer right. And so if there's a different way of approaching some of these problems, we're really happy to hear from stakeholders about them.
I'm happy to jump in on that one as well, seeing it's my special subject. I guess there's two examples, and I've almost forgotten what the second... Oh, no, I know what the second one is. The first example I want to give is... I think network tariff design is fundamental, but there's almost, an unbounded number of network tariffs that could usefully signal the use of network capacity. Where I think we have seen the real innovation, and it was the South Australian government deciding that it had the derogation powers to actually mandate a particular tariff had to be offered in South Australia, only after the two major retailers in South Australia refused to offer it. So the South Australian Power Networks constructed a tariff that has a long periods of low off-peak rates during the day. It's relatively steep in the evening, and they call it their solar sponge tariff, and it was mandated by the South Australians. What you're now getting is really good innovators piggybacking off that at the retail level. It will shock some of you to discover the peak rate for one particular retailer is 90 cents at peak times. They're not expecting people to pay 90 cents. They're signalling to people, we want customers who can actually utilise as much energy when it's really cheap. And it's 10 cents a kilowatt hour during the off-peak times, which are during the day, compared to 35 cents average. So I think part of the problem we had with tariff reform, and I was part of it and part of shaping it, is that we sort of did have a one-size-fits-all, and we were trying to balance everything. The other thing that I was going to say that goes with this as well is the things that people can't easily shift, and if they don't have solar and if they don't have an insulated house, is shift their aircon or their heating load or their cooling load. The flexible trading arrangements that Anna talks about allows people to basically say, here's the loads that are flexible, and Tim and I have talked a bit about this. I think you use the words essential and non-essential. So the things that are essential, you want at a sort of stable, flat rate price, you want, energy to be available, and you're going to pay it at that rate. But the other things you can move around during the day. So I think a lot of the debate, which has been driven by the discussion that was set up when the rule change happened, is we've just got this sort of orthodoxy that isn't actually trying to solve the consumer behaviour and optionality issue. Anyway, it's a very long answer, but I'd be reluctant to get back into a tariff review that forces us back into the same old discussion. I think we really need people in the room who are looking at innovative service offerings and what do they need to actually incentivise and reward consumer flexibility.
Thanks, Nan. Next question. Yes.
I've got a cold. Oh, you'll hold it for me? Even better. Thank you very much. Thanks. Chris Dunstan, Race for 2030 at CRC. I was really pleased to hear the use of the term customer energy resources as opposed to distributed energy resources. I've maybe customer energy solutions, but baby steps, one step at a time. But in that context is a real question of what fits within that definition. Are we just talking rooftop solar, batteries, maybe EVs? Are we talking home energy management systems? Are we actually talking about energy efficiency upgrades? And it also goes back to the question of price versus bills. And Lynn, I think you said that Brian's job is to get prices down. Did you mean bills? I'm not sure.
Jacqueline's doing bills.
Oh, okay, fair enough. My question to both you, Lynn, and to you, Anna, is do we have the right scope for AMC and for ECA in terms of what you're working on? Because traditionally, both the AMC and ECA, as I see it, have focused much more on the supply side of the equation, the supply of electricity and how consumers relate to that, the supply of gas. But those questions that have a massive impact on people's bills, like how efficient their homes are, can I get a sensible retrofit? How do I get some sort of controls, consumer controls for my air conditioner so I can do some load shifting? That's not about the energy supply system. It's about a whole range of different services, and I wonder whether our institutions have been set up in a way to actually focus on least cost solutions and reducing bills rather than just focusing on how do we have low cost supply.
It's a great point, and thanks for raising it. So Brian's the supply side and Jacqueline and Kerry are the demand side, and I hate those labels. But to your point, through our Power Shift work program, which we finished 3 years ago, everything has been about what impacts on consumer use and how much and when they use it, and those are the opportunities. And I think in Australia we've still got to find the right language that actually makes sense to speak plainly. So we talk about the demand side, we talk about demand response, we talk about flexibility, we talk about energy efficiency as if they're all different buckets. To the consumer, they're not actually different buckets. It's, can I change how much I use my hot water or when it's charged? Absolutely. Can I probably change or think about when I charge my electric vehicle during the day? Absolutely. Can I actually change my heating or cooling? Not if I live in a tent. I can't, right? So this is our approach to integrating all of those things and into the discussion. So again, prices versus bills is another way of looking at it. But I think when we were set up, which was in 2015, and Louise was there on the very first day, I think the sense of why we'd been created is to civilise the supply side, to educate consumers about the wonders of our interconnected system, the largest in the world, the greatest single machine that man has ever invented, etc. So I like to think we've made a progression, and I think I'm going to let Anna speak for herself, but I do think we're seeing in more recent times a real progression away. The supply side matters, and we have to optimise that and optimise its efficiency, but it's not enough.
I actually like the largest machine in the world. But now we're going to have all these teeny tiny little bits of that very large machine. So I would also say that when I started in this role, I was quite confused between the different terms that DER seemed to stand for, like 3 different things, and what was the difference between a distributed resource that was a solar panel and a distributed resource that was an air conditioner or a pool pump that you could use at different times. So I'm very much... I'm happy to say that I'm bringing those things together, and that they are all resources that customers have, that they have for a reason other than engaging with the energy market. So they have a car, or they have a swimming pool, or they have an air conditioning and heating that they want to manage with their house. But they do have other objectives that we can help with, which is keeping their energy bills and costs low, and other, legitimate and important objectives, including in relation to where they want to contribute to action against climate change, which I believe is one of the reasons that we had the explosion in the solar panels. So I would see our remit having, if it was only supply side or only thinking about one way, really having shifted to encompass all of that. And again, when I look at what the AER's work is about to kick off, it's really in those service providers that will be supporting customers, and I think it's across all those different asset types. So, and again, our work with the distributed energy, with the technical standards, thinking about those different players. And it is a little bit mind-boggling. We were having a conversation with the Clean Energy Council about their current role with installers, and they go, there's 9,000 of them, like very different to kind of what we're currently regulating now, and we need to find our way through, well, what is our role and how does that interact with many other roles, energy efficiency, for example, which you've mentioned. I'm passionate about that, but that's not within our remit, but important to be aware of it and important to intersect with it. And I think we may find a different home for the installation, etc., as well through the work we're about to do. So again, long-winded answer of saying, yeah, absolutely acknowledge we've got to have a much broader perception or conception of what is sitting there in customers' assets that we then want to see how they're interacting with our system.
I just add one thing to give Gavin credit for a thought experiment which he threw in at E&A, where he said, well, if we look at the 10 million homes and they invest, $50,000 in the next 20 years or so to net zero, whether that's in energy efficiency upgrades or home energy management or solar or a battery or an electric vehicle, or they swap out their hot water system and they put in a smart hot water system. So let's imagine half of their household spend $50,000. We've got $250 billion in assets sitting in consumer premises. And that's just thinking about households, let alone thinking about what happens with small business. So, it makes you think again about the scale of what we're talking about in terms of opportunity for consumers to utilise cheaper energy. That's the point. I mean, none of this would be worth it if electricity isn't going to be very cheap when it's abundant. It's also going to be very expensive when it's scarce, which is in the evening and possibly also in the morning, which is when people use most of their energy. So there's a huge challenge to take advantage of what we're going to have in a renewable system.
Other markets that they might be working with in other parts of the firm. I would always say the thing about energy that's different to other commodities is that it all goes into a central system and you turn the light on and it comes out instantly and you can't store it. And it was sort of, this was the basis of which we had to develop a system that I would then articulate to them what it looked like. But it was this kind of, and you can't store it, which is not the case anymore. So I think that shift in what we can do in our energy system is just monumental, and I think it's right across that utility scale to the small scale. And thinking about where batteries can contribute. Again, I heard someone say that hydrogen was the Swiss Army knife of the energy sector, but I actually think it's batteries. Your battery can store your energy, that can then give you energy in the periods when you don't need it. It can actually relieve you of transmission constraints in a way that means you need to build less transmission network. It can contribute to our essential system services by responding and providing frequency control. So there are so many different things that batteries can do, and I do think it fundamentally changes the way that the market will work, and it's a really interesting conversation that we've started to have, and I think this is a little way into the future, but to Lynn's point about energy will be very cheap and very expensive, what does that mean for our wholesale market? And I think I've managed to avoid talking about the capacity mechanism so far, but I think we've got a piece of work in front of us that says at the moment we've got the challenge of retirement of the old fleet. We need to replace it. We need to be confident that we're going to replace it and not have reliability issues, and we want to get the mix right of what we're replacing it with. But then in the next iteration, I think, of work that we need to do, there's this really interesting thinking around what does a market look like when you've got these two very different resources.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, because again, many of you know my background is sort of at the distribution level and sort of now at the customer level. So as I've said, the pattern without storage is it's very, very expensive in the evening. So I see the opportunity of storage being able to bridge that gap. If it's essentially not asking people to do what we're asking them to do with cost-reflective tariff reform, which was to try and manage their air conditioning on hot days in western parts of our city where, the temperature is 10 degrees hotter than it is in the areas with sea breezes. And that's going to become even more the case. So if you've got local storage, my sort of thought experiment is if you can fill the local, and I'm thinking more about front of the meter. I mean, a lot of people are thinking more about behind, on the customer side of the meter, but if you've got local storage, you can fill it up when it's cheap and when the network's not congested, and you've got that evening peak or morning peak. Again, there's all kinds of technical people that can tell me why that's all going to be terribly complicated. But I think storage, we need to do more about storage, and ECA has been talking to colleagues in North America or in the US who we're asking them to do a bit of work for us to tell us how they're addressing this challenge in Texas, where they have a very similar market structure to us, and California, where they have a very different one. But California has very similar issues around climate and weather and housing. So,
thank you. Other queries?
For my apartment, I'm charged with the hot water bill instead of gas. But for the hot water, there is no market, no default offer, no regulation about this. So whatever they charge us, we have to accept it. So my question is, because moving forward, there will be more and more embedded network and more people living in the apartment. Do we have any regulation or documents to target on this part? Yeah, I'm very curious, especially from next year. I guess gas price will be very high. And if they give me no information but charge us hot water and with no default offer or other selling price, I will be crazy. Yeah, so that's my question. Thank you.
I think it's a really good question, and I think this whole issue of the bundling of energy, in this case with tenancy, and it's been the practice, for years for small business in shopping centres and precincts and things as well. And I'm not saying that makes it work, but I guess in energy we've been very schizophrenic about it, about deciding what's energy, and I have my own rather unorthodox view. And we need to do some more work on this. It's sort of what I was really trying to drive at when I say we need to recognise how energy is bought, not how energy is sold. And some of the issues around, we can't realistically, it's hard to impose retail competition. I mean, we tried, we thought we had, but, it's not something that practically works. So some of this comes down to both transparency and disclosure, that when you're either renting or buying in properties where shared hot water, shared heating, etc. are all provided. And then there's also, I think we need to think about this as, having some kind of regulation over price as well. If there's not going to be retail competition, then thinking about what price setting and what transparency there is. But it's a whole area I think we've struggled with by actually making it an exception. And I think we're going to have to challenge that thinking about all these things are exceptions. Like, what happens when I have a subscription and I buy an electric vehicle or I lease an electric vehicle and I don't get separately charged for the electricity? It's all mixed up in the one price. And how does that actually work? So I think the exceptions are about to trip us up, and I don't have an answer, but I think I understand the problem.
I think so. AMC obviously did a piece of work on this before I started, and I think really eliminates the complexity of the issues that Lynn's just articulated. But we do see that this is an area that's getting more focus now. So a number of governments are kind of now looking at what they would like to do on embedded networks, and we in some cases been able to go and discuss what we found, and have some of that being taken on board. So I think there is some good shift in thinking around how it's been done to date. And I think also the AER, in looking at the bigger picture of different service providers entering the market, there's also an opportunity for them to sort of take a look at the question that Lynn's raised really around exceptions. Like if we're thinking about who should be regulated and how, then there's another chance there to look at the issues as well.
I'll just add one more thing as well, because again, it's a bit like, I mean, I have a bit of a varied background, but when I worked in sort of commercial, business, corporations areas, whenever there's an avenue for business to, improve their profitability by certain behaviour, if there's some sort of carve-out or, opportunity in the rules, they'll take it. So I'm not mad at them. But, we're starting to see things, and it's happening in the area we're here, in Ausgrid's area, where people have seen the value. Meriton, for example, or I probably shouldn't say, name particularly property developers, but just think about different property companies. I used to work in property funds management. You can negotiate certain arrangements. If you get connected at the high voltage level, you're going to pay way less electricity. And then how is that lower costs then shared with the people who live in the property, or is it simply just a higher rate of return for the developers? And then that also comes at a cost to everybody else, because the sunk costs of the network are the same. So if you're getting people around this area carving out ways of paying less for their electricity supply, that's costs falling on everybody else. And again, that issue's been around for a number of years, but the longer it sits there as a question, the more we see people seeking to exploit it, and we're not going to be able to avoid it.
This gentleman here has a question. This is going to be the second to last question.
My name is Hamon. I work at the Energy Corporation of New South Wales, which is the body of the New South Wales government that's developing renewable energy zones. So I see myself quite integrated in the first energy transition, really grid scale, looking at the closure of Eraring, really putting more transmission, batteries, and so working really at the first energy transition. My question is, how can we actually integrate both transitions in a way that makes sense?
You just asked my question.
Well, I can go first and let you think. I'll just give a simple proposition and let Anna take the stage more. But I guess one of the things that we're doing that sort of integrates those in a better way is we know a lot, or have spent a lot of time on transmission planning. AEMO's the transmission plan of Victoria, and we have very little transparency and very little understanding of what's happening at the distribution network level. So Brian is working quite intensively on a much better integrated system plan that actually goes beyond transmission and looks at investment in distribution and sees the trade-offs between distribution and transmission. It's certainly a feature of North American planning that is missing in Australia.
Yeah, so I think it's raising that awareness to make sure that as we're doing the second transition, we're taking into account the second. I think I'm in the no silver bullet category, so I think we do need elements of both. But when we're thinking about the planning, but also the design of the reforms that we're looking at, how do they integrate the second transition? So a good example, coming back to my friend, the capacity mechanism, is how does demand response get taken into account, either in setting what we might need for capacity, or in participating, or in some other way. So it's a really important point to keep coming back to recognise that we've got these assets which customers are going to buy one way or the other, right? So they're going to have their cars and they're going to have their solar panels. So it's really incumbent on us to say, well, given that that's we accept that will happen, how do we make sure that as we're designing the bigger picture end, we're recognising and accommodating that?
Good. That was one of my questions.
Well done.
So I'm going to be quite rude and ask the last question. What are you going to do about metering, Anna? we can't do this transition, either of them, actually, without a proper meter rollout. It's been a mess in Australia.
Yes, well, we're about to do a review to decide what we're going to do with metering. I think the challenges with where we are now, so we talk about sometimes not unscrambling the egg, so we've got to start where we are. I think that we recognise the value of, as you say, all customers, not some customers having meters, and we also recognise that the benefits are, yes, some benefits direct to customers, but there's a lot of indirect benefits that come from somewhere else. So working out really who's going to pay for it, because who's getting the benefit of it seems to me to be the critical step in then working out how do we make it happen.
Lynn, did you want to?
Yeah, I just refer this to the Nike moment. It's the longest smart meter rollout in history that hasn't yet finished. So we're leaning in to support Anna. We're probably becoming the friendly rat bag in the room, in the sense that, I'm a bit over it. I've been talking about smart meters since 2003. I've been involved in sort of virtually every process. As I often say, Italy, which is not well known for civil obedience, is now on their equivalent third smart meter rollout. The smart meter rollout never ends, in the sense that as technology changes, as functionality changes, as business use cases change, we will get richer data, more data on different features and attributes. And to me, the idea you can run a modern energy grid without that kind of visibility and data is nonsensical. So I'd also say the networks are, attempting to mitigate some of these risks by rolling it out at, it's like the old NBN argument about fibre to the premise or fibre to the node. So you've got different distribution networks rolling out data monitoring at LV transformer level because they don't have enough smart meters. So we're already paying. So in some ways, it's how do we crack this? And I'm trying to be both a rat bag and helpful. But I think we've got to get governments in the game, and I think ministers need to think about it. I was there when a South Australian minister, former South Australian minister, not the current South Australian minister, told me that smart meters kill people, when the belief in the Labor Party was that it cost the Victorian government the election. So ministers have a certain fear factor, but I think we need to try and get past that.
Thank you. And would you join with me in thanking both our speakers and contributors for that?